but we have the new national parks campaign, we call it, and we're proposing 100 new national parks across the country. Every state would have at least one. It would triple the size of the national park system acreage-wise from what it is now. Most of the land would come from existing public land, National Forest, Bureau of Land Management, some state lands, a little bit of maybe municipal, but mostly national forest lands.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This episode, our guest is Michael Kellett. Michael Kellett has worked for almost 40 years to create national parks, save forests, and protect wildlife. He is co-founder and executive director of Restore the Northwoods, a New England-based nonprofit organization. In 1994, he developed the original proposal for a 3.2 million acre Maine Woods National Park, which laid the groundwork for the 2016 designation of Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. He was lead author of the 2023 paper, Forest Clearing to Create Early Successional Habitats, Questionable Benefits, Significant Costs. He co-authored 3 pending Massachusetts bills that would designate 80% of state public lands as permanent parks and reserves. He's visited almost 270 national park areas across the United States. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Michael.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, as I was chatting with you before, we've known each other electronically for quite some time. I used to live in Vermont. I used to do a lot of work opposing biomass energy, particularly forest biomass energy, and the impacts on New England's forests and across the country. And I'd been aware of your work for quite some time and really have appreciated your trailblazing in terms of not just defending a weak status quo, but trying to move things forward to stronger protections. So I've been wanting to talk to you actually on the podcast for a while, and my excuse was there is this presentation that actually just happened. There was a panel and presentation with several folks, including yourself, and it was about fire, wildfire, but also utilizing fire as management in eastern forests, which really struck my interest because folks who listen to the Green Root podcast know that wildfire is something we're exposing as this Trojan horse for the land management agencies and industries to log our forests. They say, oh, it's in the name of wildfire. They can do whatever they want. I've been seeing this creep across the country. There's places, of course, the Southeast and upper Midwest. I hadn't heard much about Massachusetts and New England. I figured it was only a matter of time. Then I saw this panel. I'm like, oh, looks like they're trying it already. So if you can tell us, what was this panel and presentation about?
Well, the panel was for a short conference that was open to the public, and but the reason for it is that, as you say, fire, prescribed fire, human lit fires is becoming a huge thing across the Northeast, in the Midwest too, and in this along the Middle Atlantic. So more and more, this is a huge, people who want to, the guys who want to manage forests. Right now, thinning and prescribed burning are their 2 favorite things. And for someone who, in an organization that is trying to save forests and protect natural systems, this is a big problem, because if this were true that they needed to burn all over and thin all over, then how do you save natural areas? But if that's not true, then we need to expose it. So that was the whole goal. And what's been happening is we specifically focused mainly on Miles Standish State Forest in Massachusetts, which is down in Plymouth. And this is a place where they're doing really massive clearing of almost all the trees, leaving just a few spindly pitch pines, and it just looks like it's bizarre. It looks like a savanna from Africa or something. It's really weird. But they burn to keep it like that over and over and over again. But they're doing this in all across in the national forests, the White Mountain and Green Mountain National Forests. They're doing it in Rhode Island. I just was down in Rhode Island looking at taking a tour where they claim they're uh, doing the same stuff to prevent fires. And so the whole thing is based on I've been working on this, for many years, and I don't remember hearing about this huge threat of wildfires in the East. It was not even an issue. I mean, in the Southeast, there are places where there really has been natural fire, and that's a very different, but like Florida but in the New England and the Northeast, it was like, what are you talking about? And so, um, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And people in the East are not really up on this issue. It's in the West, it's an ongoing thing. Everybody's heard about it. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, but still, it's out there and people at least have heard about it. In the East, it's like a totally new thing for people. They're going, oh my God, you're kidding. There's this huge threat. And of course, it's a fear factor thing. So they say, oh my God, it's only a matter of time when the next giant inferno burns down your town or whatever. And so we have to, be ahead of it. And so this conference was to, and the Plymouth, there was a fire well, there have been several big fires in Plymouth. There was one in 1900 that burned much of the town, well, it involved much of the town. It didn't burn everything, but it was a pretty big fire. Then there was another one in 1957. There was another one in 1960, burned like 5,000 acres. And it didn't incinerate everything. It just, and it was mainly in this national or in this state forest. So, so the last fire was in 1960 of any size in Massachusetts. And in fact, that's probably the biggest one in New England since then. And basically so the conference was to sort of set the tone. What's the history of fire in the region? What has changed? Is there now a big threat? And if so, what do we need to do about it? And so we had people who, like David Foster from Harvard, retired from Harvard Forest, who did a presentation, who's done all kinds of research looking at the history of fire in the Northeast. And they've gotten cores down at the bottom of ponds, looking at charcoal, and doing it all over New England. So there's a picture of what happened and when, going back like 10,000 years, and looking at what kind of plants were growing, spores and pollen. Um, and his so he was a co-author of the paper that I was the first author on, and we looked at this issue really in depth. This was, back in 2023, beginning of 2023, it was published. So we had, we've done a lot of looking into this. We also had George Werthner do a presentation, who's an expert on fire mainly in the West, but the overall picture of fire is laws of physics. So he explained a lot of the history and so forth. He talked about home hardening, which as we know, if you look at the literature, it's pretty obvious that the best way to keep people's homes from burning is to make the homes as uninflammable as possible. And that's starting to get out into the general public now to realize that. But still, of course, they're doing all this logging and prescribed burning out in the middle of nowhere. Many times in wild areas, roadless areas that ought to be protected. So this was sort of a forest fire 101 for people in New England. There's never been a conference like this in New England. There's never been, there was a workshop or whatever put on by the town of Plymouth that was involved the fire chief and people from the land agencies or whatever talking about how this is a big threat and that it's only a matter of time when we have the next big one and we got to save your house and so forth. And they're all well-meaning. I think they really believe that it's a threat. But the science shows. So the picture that emerged from this, which we found when we did our paper, and it's not just us. There's quite a bit of other literature that supports this point of view. So go back to 1600 before, and virtually no Europeans had gotten to New England before that. Um, and before that, for thousands of years before that, pretty much fire was very rare in New England, in the whole Northeast, and including and also most of the upper Midwest. Because these forests, unlike the forests many of the forests in the West, these are moist, lush forests. There's a lot of rain pretty much year round and snow in the winter, so there's always a lot of moisture. You have originally most of New England was covered with an old growth forest. There was really very little open land. And so this forest, you couldn't burn it if you tried, nor back in the original days before Europeans came. So then Europeans show up and they mowed down the entire forest and converted it to farmland or woodlots. They built houses and they used fire, of course, all the time. They burned to clear for crops. They accidentally started things on fire. They had fireplaces that might have spewed out uh, accidental, fire embers. And then later there were trains, coal-fired trains that spewed out, you know, embers. So for after 1600, there was a period where the fire was really common in the Northeast, and of course that spread to the Midwest. There was a gigantic Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin in the late 1800s. It was and the what this all has in common is the fire followed human degradation and clearing of the forest, of the natural forest, which before that was actually burned, hardly ever burned in large fires, and only the fires that started went out very quickly. In fact, one of the things that sort of the joke that foresters used, at least in the past, is they would call the forests, especially in northern New England, the asbestos forest because it's so inflammable. In Maine, there are areas where the interval between fires was like 1,000 years, and in Massachusetts it was easily hundreds of years. And then even then you didn't get these giant millions of acres of forest fire like has happened sometimes in the West because these forests just don't burn. So so anyway, in that context, um, we have land managers, and these are public agencies, and they are working with the U.S. Forest Service, and they're working with not the wildlife management agency people. And to them, this is a big win-win. So they're saying, oh, we can, the threat of, there's this big threat, and they claim that climate change. They say, oh, well, yes, there weren't as many fires in the past, but climate change, oh, yeah, it's going to be dry and it's going to, hot, and we're going to have all these big fires. Yet there have been no big fires for decades and decades anywhere in New England. And there have been the few fires there have been are mainly brush fires, which, as you know, I'm sure in the West, that's a lot of the people's houses that are burned. It's mainly been brush fires or grassland fires. So so anyway, we went through this whole thing and basically told people, look, fire for a while, fire was a big threat when the forest was chopped up and there was slash and there was brush with the forest growing back. People had fire all over the place, um, but that era is gone. And in fact, the longer you leave and the forests are recovering. We have now large areas of forest in New England that are, they're not old growth, but they're getting older. Many of the trees in New England, many of the forests have trees, 100 years old or more. And if we leave them alone, the longer we leave them, the less fire prone they are. But instead, they're going by this false concept that you have a fuel buildup, and that means, oh, that's fire prone, and you got to clear that fuel out. And then, so their idea of fireproofing is big open areas where the wind blows through, it gets hot, gets dry, so it's actually more fire prone. And but then to keep the brush down, because even they will acknowledge that having this brush coming up in a few years, even if it's denuded, it's going to become even more fire prone. So they do these burns over and over and over again. And this is really expensive, not to mention really ecologically damaging. And also another thing we pointed out is they're doing, especially here, they're doing these burns in and around towns where people are living. And wood smoke is really toxic and it has PM 2.5 particles floating around. And so why would you burn and create this pollution near people when there's very little chance this forest is going to burn on its own? And so it's really, uh, I think what's happened is most of these guys are really not very aware of the history. They don't really understand ecology. They don't really understand the causes and effects of wildfire. And they're looking at the West and they're going, oh my God, it's going to come here. It's a catastrophe. But sorry, that doesn't cut it. We got to go by real science, and the real science says if we had large protected areas in this region and everywhere else, they're going to be much less fire prone. Then they also will, of course, have healthy natural ecosystems. The trees will. I should say, the other part of the picture here, and our paper started out talking about doing this same kind of stuff, purportedly to create early successional or young forest or open habitat for certain wildlife species that supposedly will go extinct if we don't do this. And that was actually what we started with, but then we realized that the fire thing is really interlinked with that. The whole thing is, so what they'll say is this has double benefits by clearing out brush and cutting trees and leaving this big open area where both mitigating for reducing fire risk, and we're also creating needed habitat for wildlife that require this open habitat. Except we found there are no species that need artificial clearing of standing forests in the Northeast or the upper Midwest that are in any danger of going extinct because they're not clearing forests. So basically, what they're doing is creating habitat for species that are favorite species, like woodcock and grouse that hunters like, or certain birds that bird lovers, they used to see more of them because the forest was cleared. There was more of that habitat back in the 1850s. Henry David Thoreau observed that almost all the forest at that time in the mid 1800s had been cut. So of course you get lots of those species, and there's a graph in our paper, and I hope people will read our paper, because we have a graph that shows how the forest, in 1600 it was up, the percentage of old forest or of intact forest in 1600 was up here, and then it goes way down by the mid 1800s, and at the same time all these early successional species go up. It's like an inverted bell curve. And then now it's going up, and some of these species are going down in numbers because they were artificially inflated in population. But the key thing is they're not endangered now. These are common species. They're not rare. They're not like the spotted owl or something. So what we're saying is what we need is a lot more protected, intact forest and other natural lands. And New England only about at best 3.3%, and that's an optimistic view, are fully protected from logging and other uh, development and other, active management, which means logging and burning and stuff. That's pretty pathetic. That's a tiny amount. And actually, there are large areas that, like northern Maine, where we could create a 3.2 million acre national park with where virtually nobody lives within these boundaries because it's all these large timberlands. So anyway, the point is most people don't know much at all about this, but what they hear, of course, they hear about on the news, they see all these fires out west. And then they hear these land managers here saying, "Oh, it's coming, it's going to come here. We got to act before it gets here." So, and that means we got to do this thinning and burning of the forest. So that's what this was about. And it kind of we are hoping this could be sort of the first step of pushing back because talking, they've really worked on selling local towns and stuff on that this is a big threat. And so people are going, oh, gee, thank goodness they're thinning our forest and cutting and burning. So,
Yes. Well, thank you for that overview. Is that conference available as a recording or is that just a one-time thing?
no, it will be, in fact, they're going to split up there were four presentations, including mine, and they're splitting those up so people will be able to see them. So it's not available yet, but it should be fairly soon. Yeah, and it would be really good. They're really good in terms of understanding these issues, which you don't, there's not much literature on Eastern fire. There's really not. You have to know where to look. So it's hard for people to get the real facts on this.
Absolutely. And it's hard for people to get the real facts in the West. And unfortunately,
Right,
this is reinforcing my fears that the failure of most environmental groups to adequately fight against the disinformation out West, not only is it about to and currently resulting in tons of logging out here and plans like we've never seen before. It's now moving across the country because this model was, quote, successful. They were
right.
able to put out enough propaganda, and I'm in the thick of it every day. It's very
Yeah,
frustrating. I have now proof, solid proof, that our media outlets here are inquiring about this. They're asking elected officials, mostly these agencies, so
yeah,
what about these concerns? These agencies are either misleading or providing one sided information, often just straight out disinformation and defamation. Media's like, well, they're telling us not to cover it, or they're just not talking to us. So I guess we won't cover it. And so it's this wildfire hysteria. There are things
right.
to do, and it's right around homes and communities. But if you even look at the best studies that the U.S. Forest Service has, their best evidence, it actually does not show that it protects communities. They'll even
Right.
admit it in parts of the study. Of course, the conclusion is we have to do this, and then the talking point larger. But I'm really disturbed to see that our failure in the West to combat this adequately, they're now exporting this and trying to
Yeah,
superimpose it into a place that there is or pretty much zero kernels of truth to
right.
build around.
Right. And the conservationists in the Northeast tend to be pretty progressive and really like forests and want to protect wildlife and forests, but they don't know much about Western fire at all. And so that's part of what we were doing is trying to bring our friends and colleagues up to speed here on this because there's so much misinformation from these agency people. And you hear when you hear the agency people's rationale for this, it just doesn't hold water. They just don't really there. And it's interesting. There is no science showing that there was ever any large amount of fire in the Northeast until Europeans came. There's plenty that shows that there was very little. You had Native Americans living along the coast and in the river valleys in some places, and they used it locally, but there was never any large scale burning because they wouldn't have been able to do large scale burning even if and why would they? They didn't need to. So that didn't happen on a large scale, and there were no natural fires on a large scale. So it's a totally unnatural thing. So then they say, oh, but climate change is changing everything. So it's going to be just an inferno with climate change. There's no evidence that that's true. They don't really know. Nobody knows. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that the best way to address climate change and prevent negative impacts as much as possible is to leave forests alone and let them keep them intact and have large intact areas because they're more resilient to change and they can adapt better and they have natural openings like so you don't have to worry about creating artificial openings because they have the full biodiversity. And that's what we need in the Northeast more, and of course we need it out west as well and in the Midwest. But that that's what our argument is. We just need more big protected areas. And if you want to, if you have some little piece of land and you want to do burning and you don't burn up your neighbors, that's your business. We don't think it's a great idea, but we shouldn't be doing that on public land anywhere. It doesn't make any sense. And we don't have that much public land. And in Massachusetts, though, about 12%, I think, of the state is public land. Most of it's state land. So that's not insignificant when most people probably don't think that there's even that much in Massachusetts, but there's actually quite a bit. So what we have, we ought to be protecting instead of burning and cutting and it's shocking when you go out and see what they're doing. It's the other thing about that is that, and we pointed this out in our paper, when you do this intensive management, uh, it has to be done endlessly, over and over and over again, because even as George Werthner pointed out, in the way, there is evidence that in some cases, maybe thinning and burning, if it's maybe close to within a short ways from buildings, might reduce fire intensity and so forth, but it's got to be kept clear over and over and over again every few years, or it's going to become brush and it's actually going to be worse. So that's that somebody's going to pay for that. You got to pay for that. So I mean, my feeling is, and it's got to be endless. And so do we really think 100 years from now people are going to be going, time to go out and burn the back 40 on the Miles Standish State Forest? I don't think so. So at some point, people are going to say that was really stupid, and then they're going to go, what do we do with this? They made a mess. Um, so what we ought to be doing is thinking ahead and realizing what really makes sense and what doesn't. And the other one last thing on this is that, and this is, I think, in the West, a big problem is there's sort of now a self-feeding machine here where there's a lot of federal money for fire prevention and mitigation and stuff. And so there are firefighters. There, like the state of Massachusetts has like 15 full-time fire people on the state working for the state agency when you hardly ever have fires. And what happens is they end up sending them out west to fight fires in the west. And it's all paid for. Most of this probably is federal money that's funding this stuff. And so then you have a whole infrastructure of fire people who are invested in fire, believe that, we got to fight them. And you have people whose job it is to do this. And I don't think they're, these are bad people or anything. I think they're just doing what anybody would do. It's their job and so forth. But you create this system where it's self-perpetuating, even if it doesn't make sense. So anyway, it's a big threat in the East because they use it's not just that they go in and light some tiny little fires and go away. It's endless intensive manipulation and this is, we don't have that much intact forest to begin with. So that's why we're saying we need more protection. Here's a good example of why we need to protect from this kind of stuff. And they want us to believe, oh, the big threat is Walmarts and and condos or something, but really over the acreage where they're doing logging, burning, manipulation like that is way more than the amount of development that's going on.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And wanted to make a few points about what you had said. So, at least in the West here, and I'm not sure what it is in the East, the vast majority of this so-called prescribed fire is actually after logging. So it's linked directly with logging. In some cases,
Right.
what they call a prescribed burn is actually just pile burning of the slash left
Yeah.
over. But what percentage would you say is just pure fire versus logging plus fire? Just a ballpark.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's much pure fire
Okay.
here
Yeah.
because really they're starting in areas where wasn't logging recently. And so and you couldn't really, you couldn't do a fire in most of these forests. It wouldn't burn. So you really have to clear some of the stuff away, to be able to even get it to burn. And they have to use those torches and stuff. And so it's not,
Yeah.
I mean, there's not, in southern New England at least, there isn't much of a timber industry. It's really
Sure.
very minimal. So it's more driven by the state agencies
Yes.
that are, management, obsessed about managing everything. So that's,
Yeah. Well, we're
but
finding that here too. Yeah.
yeah, and so, but the good thing about that is it's not like there are millions of people whose jobs depend on this. It's really a pretty small number of people, and it's a small part of the economy. Even in Maine, it's a shrinking part of the economy, and in northern New England. So it's really this bureaucracy that's funded by the public that's perpetuating most of this. So theoretically, we can rein this in by just stopping it, demanding that it stop.
Right.
And but most people don't know enough, as you know, to really weigh in on this. But I'm hopeful of, when people hear about this, they think it's crazy. So
Yeah, well, but it's trickier than that because the way they framed it is those who are critical of doing all of this manipulation, we want our communities to burn down. I mean, that's how I am
right,
being
yeah,
demonized. Folks like me are being demonized.
right,
And most
right,
people who you actually talk to behind the scenes, even people in the Forest Service. I spoke to a fellow the other day, he actually works for the Forest Service in this area where they're planning to do this gigantic logging project in the name of fire. And I was like, okay, we disagree on some stuff. Do you think they should be going all the way out there and doing that? And he's like, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense. He'll never say that publicly. Even enviros are afraid to weigh in on this. All the stuff that's
yeah,
going on around roadless stuff, a lot of people, the vast majority, I would say almost all of the legitimate environmental community has been pushing back against the rescinding of the roadless rule. What very few of them are willing to mention is that the main Trojan horse for the rollback of the roadless rule is wildfire. The press release from the Forest Service
right,
said it
right,
5 times.
right,
So we have to tackle this issue. And I know a lot of listeners of the Greener podcast are like, why is Josh so obsessed with wildfire and forest? Because it is that Trojan horse, this greenwashing that's being used to get
right,
everywhere. And I feel like I've been accused of being an alarmist. It turns out I wasn't alarmed enough based
right,
on what I'm learning
right,
in the East Coast. And one thing I just
right,
wanted to mention real quick, because a lot of times people will say, okay, but there was indigenous burning, and there certainly was. We had somebody on the podcast in 2021, and the topic was an indigenous perspective on land use. Um, I cannot pronounce the name of the tribe, Kanai in Kehaka Nashawa Nip Mook. Sorry, I'm sure I
mm,
butchered that. But anyway, what he talked about is, of course, there was some burning right around local communities in
right,
some hunting areas, maybe some areas where they were cultivating certain wild plants. But the idea that native people who had a reverence for the land, even if that's
right,
sometimes romanticized, but they're not out there willy nilly just starting fires across
right,
the whole
right.
landscape. Why would they do that? That's
Exactly. Why would they? I
ridiculous.
mean, if you put yourself in their place, I mean, like in Massachusetts, they lived on the ocean. They had fish, they had mussels, They had, you had deer in inland, you had birds, you had all kinds of lush greenery and stuff. They didn't need to burn for, just maybe to clear some space. They would do a little bit, and it was hard to do, so it probably didn't burn that much anyway. And so they basically had a pretty light touch on the land, which is great. And we should be happy about that. And, I know in California, they did some larger scale burning, but even there, they weren't burning thousands and thousands of acres at a time. But the guys who want to manage want, to them, that's sort of a straw they grasp. Oh, yes, everything, it's like the Anthropocene people who say everything has been managed by humans. So in fact, there's no reason, there's no real wilderness, nothing's natural. And so it's
Right.
fine to just, and that's the kind of stuff that it's really a lot of it is rationalization by the management
Yes.
oriented people. But you're right. People, I mean, people, I wouldn't want my house to burn. So it's understandable when they say, oh, if you don't do this, your town's going to burn. People don't, even though most of these big recent fires where a bunch of houses burned and people died were mostly grass and brush oriented
Yes.
fire, like the one on Maui. That was just grassland that had been grazed and then they let it grow to be about 3 feet high or whatever, and it was super flammable. And so a lot of it, I think, is education. And you're right, there's a lot of people are getting this bogus stuff. And also, as you pointed out, the news media generally don't get this at all. They talk about all the, fires destroyed the forest and blah, blah, blah. And as you know, wildfires, they don't burn everything to begin. It's very patchy. Even the strongest fires, and also, of course, in the wilderness, in the wildlands, fire is a good thing. It's a natural thing. But they've tried to create this feeling that large fires are horrible and we need to stop uh, big fires, but then they'll say, oh, well, fire suppression in the past was a mistake, so now we have to fix that by logging and burning. So it's like they grasp at any argument they can come up with to excuse management. It's really got people who think humans can and should manage everything. That's really the mentality.
No,
And
I totally agree.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's 100% accurate in my opinion. The Native American piece, just to close that out, some people claim it's basically a kind of cultural misappropriation. So there's that term cultural appropriation that
Mhm.
has controversies around it, whatever. But the idea they're culturally misappropriating. So they're actually falsifying the history in order to make them seem legitimate. And yeah,
Mhm.
I think it's important what you said before. Clearly, the logging industry is a part of this. This is their wet dream. They love this.
Mhm.
But I think that at this point, equal push, if not more so, is from the bureaucrats and the agencies that are just giving themselves tasks to do. And you're saying this
Right.
endless
Right.
management. Go
Right.
in, they make a mess. Guess what? We have to clean up our mess over and
Right.
over and over
Right.
again. And at some point, people have to say, in my opinion, it's like, let's just say that there is a way to clean it up, which in my opinion is letting the forest grow. But
Right.
you're not the ones to do it because your track record is
Yeah.
dismal. So get out. That's my
Exactly.
take.
And the
But
other
people
thing
don't.
is no, that's totally right. And in fact, the cases where there are some things where they've been saying the same thing for years. For example, I remember in Michigan working on national forest plans in the 1980s, the first round of forest plans. My job was to read these and comment. So I read them cover to cover, super carefully, marked them up. And I mean, there was just all kinds of bogus stuff in there. But one of the things that they claimed in Michigan was, oh, oaks aren't regenerating. Oak regenerate, so we need to do logging underneath the current oaks and clear everything out and scarify the soil so the oak seeds can, grow. Well, guess what they're saying today, right? I just went to Rhode Island on a tour. They said, oh, oak regeneration. They're not regenerating. We got to log underneath the oaks. And so, I mean, it's idiotic. If it works so well, there shouldn't even be a problem. They supposedly knew the solution 40 years ago. So you're right. You know, why would you believe the people who created the problem in the first place? It was the famous Einstein may or may not have said it, but he basically said, the people who created the problem are not the ones to solve the problem. And that's why I
Exactly.
say, and you notice there really are very few pure forest ecologists who aren't working as foresters or working on management or whatever who think that this stuff is a good idea. They're really, I don't know any. A lot of them won't say it publicly
Right.
because they get blasted by the agency people or they won't be able to get a job. But it's really driven by foresters and the management and also wildlife management people because of course, they love to have things all cleared out for their favorite species. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
They're
really
looking at.
think, it's getting the word out to the public.
Mhm.
And again, like many of our problems, protecting forests and protecting natural systems is the best solution. It's not simple. It's not that complicated.
Right. Well, and I want to close by talking about that because more and more I'm coming to terms with the fact that while we have to keep playing defense, which means debunking their
Right,
disinformation, protecting forest by forest, we need to do lawsuits to do that to stop timber sales. All that is
right,
crucial. I liken
right,
that to being on a hockey team and you have goalies. If you don't have a goalie, you're
right.
going to lose. The goalie might actually be the most important member technically of the team.
Mhm.
But if you don't have anyone moving forward on offense to score goals,
Right,
you're still going to lose because we can't stop every goal coming our way.
right,
So right now we're having the East Coast maturing in terms of age of forest. A lot of that is mature, can start qualifying depending on your definition. It's kind of an arbitrary term, but old
yeah.
growth forest,
Hmm.
let's just say valuable for cutting down, but also
Hmm.
increasingly biodiverse, et cetera, et cetera. So you have had a long-standing vision for how to go on the offense in terms of forest ecosystem protection. So tell us a
Right.
little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're just gearing up to sort of break out into the public with this, but we have the new national parks campaign, we call it, and we're proposing 100 new national parks across the country. Every state would have at least one. Um, that would triple the size of the national park system acreage wise from what it is now. Most of the land would come from existing public land, National Forest, Bureau of Land Management, some state lands, a little bit of maybe municipal, but mostly national forest lands. And to me, number one, you're protecting important areas, but when you do that, you draw a line around it, and the logging, the Park Service does do some not great projects like in Sequoia National Park. And I think they've been infiltrated actually by Forest Service the management people and fire people. So they've sort of bought into that. But I think that's a blip. Overall, national forests or national parks, the Park Service doesn't like management to any great extent. So you take the certain areas away from the Forest Service and the BLM and make them national parks, you automatically get all of this management stuff out of the way. It's done. And um, then there are other areas that, like national monuments on Bureau of Land Management lands, which are far from perfect, but most of them at least that's a step in the right direction. So we could come back later and give those full protection. So if we did that, all of a sudden you could, and we've tried to pick the most areas that are important and also are near people in city, because as we know, the eastern US has very few big protected natural areas. So a high priority is to protect basically all the national forests in the east would become national park areas, almost all of them. And large amount of state land, like Michigan has a bunch of state land that's being butchered. A good chunk of those state forests would go along with federal lands could become national parks. But anyway, the point is everybody knows what a national park is. Everybody loves national parks. Um, and so when you tell them, this is not like taking your medicine to solve these problems. When we save a forest by making it a national park, you get a national park. It's a beautiful place you can go to. You can enjoy it. you get clean water and clean air. So there are many benefits you're going to get. And in the meantime, you're not paying, most of the public logging is subsidized by the public. So your money is actually being lost to destroy your forests. So anyway, and the thing is, there are groups around the country that are interested, either actively talking about parks for a particular area, or they're thinking about it, or they're working on an area looking for a solution. And we're saying, what about a national park? So what about expanding Rocky Mountain National Park, going up to into Wyoming, going all the way down the Front Range to the southern end of the forest down there to the what are the Twin Peaks down there? It's my random access memory. I'm south of Pueblos, or southwest of there.
You mean
Oh,
Pikes Peak
no,
or,
south of
oh,
Pikes Peak. What is that? That's there's so many of them, I lose tracks of them. It's these Twin Peaks where there's a wilderness there. It's a
I don't know.
it's a
What?
disjunct piece of, I think, the San Isabel National Forest.
Oh, okay. Huh.
So anyway, you could go all the way, like 4 million acre park, would include a bunch of roadless areas. And those, as you well know, those are areas they're butchering for supposed fire mitigation and so forth. And here they're right near all these, Colorado Springs, Pueblo. But those people aren't near a national park right now. They have to go all the way up to Rocky Mountain, which is crowded. So if you look, area by area, we can solve problems by creating new parks. It's not just like some pie in the sky thing. So anyway, and we're talking to groups around the country. We're working on creating a coalition of groups, and eventually doing a national. I think doing a national campaign is the way to overcome there. If you do it on a state level, you get hit with the opposition and money from industry and stuff. It's very hard to overcome that on a state level, even a regional level, like the NARIPA, the Northern Rockies Wilderness Act. It's a great idea, but even over several states, it's really tough to move it forward. So
I think that's a beautiful vision and it fits right into the offense, or we don't even have to look at it in
yeah,
that terms, just in terms of proactive protection, like a positive element of this is what
right,
we're trying to bring people around. Naripa is a good example. It is a tough row to hoe for sure. For folks who don't know, Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which would incorporate large areas of land. There's also out further west in California proposals for the Range of Light National Monument to connect areas. There's this climate refuge proposal in Montana and northern areas. There is Yellowstone to Uintas from Wyoming to Utah. There are these climate preserve ideas in the Shawnee National Forest. So a lot of folks are moving forward with kind of local scaling up to national. And I think that's
right.
exactly where we need to be going. And you've been leading the way on those concepts for decades, I think, at this point.
Well, I think, it's got to be a team effort, obviously, and I can't do it. I can't sit here and declare that they become parks, but I hope I can sort of help to elevate places that people aren't thinking about, or where groups think, oh, it ought to be a park, but how can we ever overcome the opposition? But if we all work together and we create a movement, that's how they got the Alaska Lands Act through in 1980. Is the entire political infrastructure in Alaska was against protecting, creating parks and wilderness in Alaska. Yet it happened, and that's because they created a national movement, got people across the country to see that this was important for everybody. And that's what we need to do, is have people in New York see that, oh, okay, the Finger Lakes, we could take the Finger Lakes National Forest and put that with state lands, and there's a Finger Lakes Trail that connects them, and we could have it wouldn't be gigantic, but it would be a beautiful small national park within, an hour and a half drive or whatever from New York City. And all across the country, there are potential for those sorts of things. So it's not like some areas get left out. That's the thing. Everybody needs to feel like there are two areas in Puerto Rico that we're proposing. And so anyway, that's a whole other thing, but we have a website that's not up yet, but it will be, and it's newparks.org. So, and we have our restore website is restore.org, and we'll have information on basic information there, but we're going to have a whole website just on the new national parks thing. So
That's awesome. I'm really excited about that. Definitely want to keep in touch with you and collaborate more on that, because I think that's an excellent concept whose time has more than come. And I think people are excited about public lands right now. And I think they're having to realize that our defensive battles have been necessary, but not sufficient. And we have the Trump administration opening up all this stuff that frankly was also created under the Democrats and
yep,
supported by. So it's not just right versus left here. Democrats and
right,
Republicans are both not been great on this. Maybe by
right.
establishing this clear vision, we can have some more champions in the Democrats, and who knows, maybe Republicans. There's nothing technically about being a conservative that means you have to be hostile towards ecosystems,
No,
technically.
no. And in fact, two examples. The most recent national park designation was New River Gorge in West Virginia, which was a national river, which is lesser elevation than national parks. Everybody knows what a national park is. Well, most of the congressional members who supported the legislation are Republicans, and the local state legislators were Republicans, and it's a very conservative area where it is. But the business community said, "Whoa, this is a great idea." So it had by partisan support. There's a bill right now that was introduced in Florida to designate a Florida Springs National Park, which is on our top 100 list. And he's a conservative Republican who was elected just recently. And I saw he did a news conference, and he said, if you cut out a few things about reducing government waste or whatever, but he was saying, they say that national parks are the best idea America ever had, and this is a conservative Republican. So I think it's a little more difficult because there are other issues, but I think when you show that it's beneficial and to the people in their district and in their state, a lot of Republicans, even conservative ones, will support national parks. So I think we need to start with here's the idea, here's why it would be good, convince the public, and I think a lot of people will go along, even conservatives. So we'll see, and it's not going to, this is the kind of thing, as it takes years. So it's going to take at least several years to gear up to the point where we really have enough oomph to actually get legislation, move it through the Congress, even in the best of times. So, but as you say, people are ready for something positive. We hear so much negativity, and it's not just with Trump coming along. It's been like that for a number of years, where people just don't feel like we're getting positive protection for nature. We're seeing it rolling back, in fact. So something, as you say, that's positive and forward-looking, and actually would permanently protect these lands as much as we can. I think a lot of people would be open to that.
Absolutely. And I definitely am. And I hope our listeners are as well. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the Green Root podcast and for all your great work. And we'll have the links available for people to get a hold of you through your website, restore.org. So thanks again, Michael.
Thanks, Josh.